right into it. So last time, like I mentioned already, we did Hammurabi's Code, okay? Now remember, Hammurabi's Code is a law code that covers almost every aspect of everyday life, okay? We already went into pretty much detail. You guys did a document on it, right? That was one of the homework assignments we did, okay? It covers all aspects of life of the area. Now, however, the only problem with Hammurabi and his empire was that it didn't last that long. It lasted really generally like his rule only lasted really like I think 50 years, but then after him, that civilization kind of took his ideas and kind of ran with it. Right. The important thing to understand about Hammurabi's Code is that it became the law code that a lot of civilizations that end up being successful end up copying what he did. Not to the T, not exactly, but you can definitely point to a lot of aspects of Hammurabi's Code in a lot of different civilizations. Okay, and we'll go through all the different major law codes that do affect even modern day, and we'll go through that as we go through the chapters. Okay, so with that being said, let's just jump right into Egypt. Okay, so Egypt is a very fun topic. Now, unfortunately, with the way things are right now, especially with COVID, we can't really spend as much time in details of Egypt as we would like to. Normally, we would spend a day or two on Egypt alone, but obviously one day in class, one day out of class is best thing we can do for right now. But to kind of get us started, Egypt, just like Tigris and Euphrates, depended on the river system to kind of get us going. Okay, Egypt depended on the Nile. Now, yeah, it's the same PowerPoint as the other one. It's if you look in chapter 2 at the very top, it should say chapter 2 PowerPoint. And it says Pleasantville on it. Yeah, it's the same one. It's just now we're in section 2. Okay. So when you take a look at the Nile River, okay, there are some differences between the Nile River and the Tigris and Euphrates River.
Please pardon the interruption, but if any teachers are in need of more PPE, please leave your basket outside your classroom doors at this time, and they'll be filled. Thank you.
Okay, so some of the things that are really important is the Nile River really was the sole reason for anyone to live in that area, right? Because if you take a look at this map here, the green areas are the only areas that have fertile soil enough for crops to be planted and grown. Everything outside of that is wasteland, right? It's basically desert. So in order for people to survive, you had to cling close to the river itself. If you look at the map, there are red dots, and those dots are cities that are really developed alongside the river itself. Okay, but let's watch a quick little video I put here that talks about the geography of Egypt as well. Just another source to help you guys understand. So let's take a look.
Hey, world history students, going to take you on a quick tour of the geography of ancient Egypt, help you label your map, get ready for your map quiz, and also know a few things about the importance of the Nile River in ancient Egypt. So getting started, first of all, you need to realize that Egypt is located in the midst of the Sahara Desert. You look at North Africa and most of it is a barren wasteland except for a few coastal areas. The only exception here is the Nile floodplain. Over here you can see this fertile land that is visible from outer space. This is a NASA satellite photo. So Herodotus refers to Egypt as the gift of the Nile. In this picture you can see the effect of the Nile on the land. In this area around the Nile you've got greenery, you've got things that can grow, and then you look out in the horizon and you see this desert wasteland. No Nile, no Egypt. And Egypt was blessed with regular floods on an annual basis. Every September or so, the Nile River would flood and go for miles out, but it would leave fertile soil in its wake. And so you can see here that the Egyptians are able to adopt agriculture or able to establish food surpluses because of the Nile River. Without this, there would be no civilization existing here. The Nile also served as a highway uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, allowing people to transport crops, troops, consumer goods, and heavy objects. This is before the age of choo-choo trains and 18-wheelers and stuff like that. Now let's take a quick look at a map of Egypt, courtesy of Jeff Dahl, who made this and made it available to the public. And I'm going to help you identify some places that are going to be on your map quiz. First of all, bodies of water. You can see the Mediterranean Sea to the north. You can see the Red Sea to the east of Egypt. And then you can see the Nile River here at the center. The green area around the Nile River is the Nile floodplain. Here in the north, emptying into the Mediterranean Sea, is the Nile Delta. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that. And you can see all of this fertile land here. In the Nile Delta, lots of cities in ancient Egypt. You can see also here the city of Memphis, which was the capital of the Old Kingdom. Now, here and there, you see some green spots in the desert. These are oases. An oasis looks like this. It's a small pond or lake, in some cases a rather large pond or lake in the middle of the desert. So this is Lower Egypt. Now keep in mind when we talk about Upper and Lower Egypt, the Egyptians didn't have a map like we do where everything points north. They thought about everything as either being upriver or downriver. So Upper Egypt is upriver, Lower Egypt is downriver. Looking at Lower Egypt one more time, you can see the Sinai Peninsula. This is a divider between the continents of Africa and Asia, Egypt being on the northeast corner of the continent of Africa. And then we go to Upper Egypt. This is where the new kingdom's going to be based. Here on the bend in the river, you can see the city of Thebes.
For this, okay, so cool. So when you take a look at the video, kind of pushes this as well, but I'll just mention it again. The idea that the gifts of the Nile, right, that's what they called it, was the fact that it left deposits of fertile soil, right? And when it flooded, it was annual flooding, so it happened every year around the same time, versus when you look at the Tigris and Euphrates, the flooding was inconsistent, right? It just happened whether it was too much or too little, and it didn't happen in a set period of time for those people to kind of be able to plan for it. However, the Nile River was different, right? It was a lot easier to categorize when it was going to come and how much it will. Like whether it was going to be a big flood or a smaller flood, it was a lot easier to kind of tell, which means it was a lot easier for them to plan ahead of time, okay? Now, as you mentioned in the video, right, if you take a look at the satellite view, right, there's only one piece of area in which they can farm, and that was with the Nile. Everywhere else, they couldn't. So that's why the Nile River was essential for them to survive. That was the only reason why there is an Egyptian civilization at all, okay? Now, what's interesting about this location is that the river provides all these good things, but the deserts actually provide a defense barrier for a lot of nomadic tribes that were trying to invade Egypt. Because now, if let's just say you're trying to invade them from the west, you have to pass through the Sahara Desert to get to them, right? So it makes it a lot easier for them to defend themselves. And on top of that, based on their location where the Mediterranean's up here and the Red Sea's to the right of them, now they have access to different civilizations and trade, right? It makes it a lot easier for them to trade with different groups. Okay, so as he was mentioning at the very end, there's Upper Egypt, which would be on this side, and then Lower Egypt's at the bottom. And the reason why, so let me ask you, why do you think they labeled this area Lower Egypt? Why? Yeah. Say it again? Yeah, because the river went upwards. Like it was, this is where the river would go this way, as it would go to the north. That's how it would go down into the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so they always considered it as in being Upper Egypt is where the delta is, where the river. Lower Egypt is where the river delta is, where the river is going into the ocean. Okay. Now, there's some terms here that I have to explain to help you guys understand some things. A cataract, all right? A cataract is basically a point in the river, which the cataract is down here, where it makes it impossible to travel along that part. And what it is basically, it's almost like a kind of like a waterfall where it's shallow at certain spots, and all of a sudden stones make it rapid, and then there's a cliff. It divots down into another part. So it's impossible to travel past the cataract, right? I mean, like, well, yeah, past that cataract. But after the cataract ends, which is right here, the river becomes steady, very calm. And that allows the Egyptians to kind of use this in a lot of different ways. As the video had mentioned, for trade, for transporting troops, for transporting produce. These are all things that they used. And it's completely different than the Tigris and Euphrates River because that river was very inconsistent, right? They only used it for, they had to use irrigation systems to use it. But the Nile River was a lot calmer. It was a lot easier to control, which means that when it's easier to control and easier to, for transport and trade, they can now focus on other things, right? Now, what's interesting is we look at both the upper and lower parts of Egypt had their own kingdoms at a certain point. Now, the way we know this is that there was a lot of pictures that talked about how the upper Egypt had a white crown, okay? And the lower Egypt had this red crown. There was one man, however, that historians point to, King Narmer, that ended up seeing as the person that united both these kingdoms. And the reason why we think that is because all the pictures of King Narmer had a mixture of both crowns, right? Now, over time, we end up, when we decipher what the hieroglyphics mean, we end up learning more about this, but for a certain period, we can only assume based on the images we see of him, right? And this happened around 3000 BC, right? Now, he establishes the first Egyptian dynasty, but his dynasty may not last long, but the traditions that he creates kind of continue for many years, okay? Some of the traditions is the importance of pharaohs as gods, all right? Now, we saw in Mesopotamia that the leaders were both military leaders and also religious leaders, and the same thing can be said about the pharaohs. The pharaohs were closest beings to God, and that's why they were placed at the very top of the social pyramid, okay? Now, they are considered a theocracy, right? We talked about this last time, where a theocracy is they use the religious code, also associates with their law code, right? There's no separation of church and state. They're both the same thing, right? So that's why the pharaoh is considered the head of the state, but also the head of the religion as well, okay? Now, along with pharaohs came the pyramids. Now, what were the pyramids? How were they built? Yeah. Well, why? Sorry, why were they built? Yeah, and in other cases, like small ones, were also of their family members, right? So they were built for several different reasons. Firstly, they were built for tombs for the pharaohs. The religion of Egyptians believed that you continue to live in the afterlife, okay? And whatever you are buried with are the possessions that you have with you as you go to the afterlife. So when it came to now the pharaohs, who were deemed as gods, they wanted to have all their stuff with them, right? They wanted to bring all the cool luxury goods. So they wanted to build these massive tombs so that in the afterlife they can go and kind of lounge about and do whatever they want with all their stuff, right? So that was one reason. Another reason that these pyramids were ginormous was because it tried to show how strong that pharaoh was during their time. Because it takes many years to build a pyramid. So who do you think planned out the pyramid itself? The pharaoh. So imagine, it's like once you step in as the ruler, your first order of business is to now create your tomb. That's the first thing you do when you walk in. Because you're like, I got to make this tomb the greatest, largest, the best one compared to all the other ones. And every time they created a tomb, they tried to one-up the other person. Because they want to show that their tomb was the best, because they were the best leader, right? They were favored by the gods. When you take a look at how these things are built, okay, first off, they're around the 2 to 15 ton stone blocks. I can't even imagine how they were able to do this, because they didn't have cranes. They didn't have machinery to do this. They literally had manpower. They took slaves and they had them literally carry these rocks, these stones, to build pyramids. Now, what's interesting is, I mean, there's always conspiracy theory that, you know, the aliens helped them. They gave them technology, all that stuff. But to understand how difficult it is and what they were able to do for this time period, they were geniuses at architecture, geniuses at mathematics, using different angles to kind of lift these stones up in certain points. They used basically these giant ton stone blocks and put them on pieces of wood and used to push them up the side of the pyramid. So what they would do is they would have like logs, giant logs, put it on the log and then push it up like a wheel. And then as the log passed, people would take the log and put it in the front of the block and just continue that entire process going all the way up the pyramid to place the block in the correct location. Okay? So when you take a look at the interior of a pyramid, it's very convoluted, right? They built certain mechanisms for certain reasons. There are certain traps because they wanted to make sure that people that are trying to raid these pyramids would get trapped in them, right? So if you ever take a look at a pyramid tour, what they do is, and first off, if you are claustrophobic, you should not go in a pyramid, right? They basically have tunnels that you have to really climb through to get through to certain parts, all right? So these tunnels here are very narrow. And if, like I said, if you look at a modern day tour of a pyramid, you can see exactly what I mean. They're like little tunnels that you literally would have, they built stairs in them for you nowadays, but you climb through them to get to certain parts of the pyramid. And what they did was at a certain point, when everything was built and God bless you, they fixed the inside, right? What they would do is the priest would do the last blessing of it, and they would pull this one rock that would then collapse the rocks to trap the pharaoh, the dead pharaoh, inside. So there's no way people can get in. Now, the way we got in eventually was because there were grave robbers that literally used dynamite to blow up the entrances to get into the pyramids, because understand, these are all the luxury items of the pharaoh. So they must be, pretty high-end luxury goods. So people went in there, tried to steal all the stuff. So they blew up entrances, and that's how we ended up getting in there, like more modern times, just to see for ourselves. Yeah. They would end up having just to finish it themselves. What they would do is in mummification, they would try to keep the body in like a mummified state. And I'll show you the next slide is actually about mummification. They'd put them in a mummified state, and then they would obviously put them in the pyramid when it is completed. And sometimes that did happen. Sometimes they would do is probably for the time being put them in a smaller structure so that when the final pyramid's created, then they can put them in the larger one. But this kind of goes along with religion, right? As I mentioned already, religion, they believe that there's an afterlife, right? And part of the thing that has to go along with afterlife is they have to keep their body secure, right? Because remember, if their body is not secure, and they believe the soul can be let out of the body, so they have to keep them in almost like a saran wrap state. And that's what mummification is. So let's take a look at how they do mummification.
This is a mummy of a young man named Heraclides. He died in Egypt in the 1st century AD when he was about 20 years old. Mummification was developed by the ancient Egyptians to preserve the body for the afterlife. Typically, all internal organs were removed before mummification, with the exception of the heart. But in this case, the heart was removed and the lungs were left intact. Next, the body was covered with salt and left for about 40 days until all moisture was eliminated. Perfumed oils and plant resins were rubbed on the body. Thick layers of resin were applied to glue the strips of linen that were wrapped around the body. The mummy was placed on a wooden board, and more wrappings bound them together. a mysterious pouch, perhaps of religious significance, was placed on the chest. A mummified ibis, a wading bird with a slender, down-curved bill, was placed on the abdomen. Ibis mummies commonly served as votive offerings to the gods, but this is an unusual case of a bird being mummified with a deceased human. Long linen strips further secured the wrappings. A portrait panel of Heraclides was placed over the face. A large linen cloth was wrapped around the mummy. The shroud was painted red with an imported lead-based pigment. This treatment is rare. Very few red shroud mummies are known to exist. Egyptian symbols of protection and rebirth were painted on the outer cloth with pigments and gold. Finally, Heraclides' name was written in Greek at the feet. Thanks to this remarkable mummification process, Heraclides' body is with us today.
Okay, so when you take a look at the yeah.
I didn't know about all the wrappings if they didn't undo mummification.
You're saying, like, how did the people after the fact know about it? Like so when they dug into it, like they actually cut it open, they saw the different layers of linen that they had used to look at. Because just think, every single time they basically had put like a layer of glue, like basically like a layer of thick glue, and then another layer of linen. So when they dug into it and they opened up the mummification, they found that they saw all these different layers of linen were in place. Now, what's interesting, guys, is the whole purpose of this was, as I mentioned already, like the metaphor for it was like saran wrap. They want to saran wrap the person to the point where that person's body will not decay. There's a reason why that when you look at today's, like those that are deceased and then put in coffins, that their bodies are decayed way past the limit, like where even the bones start to decay as well, is because bacteria gets to them, right? And they eat away at the skin and the bones. Now, when you look at mummification, a lot of times the bodies left behind are not really, they aren't really as decayed as what a modern day body would be, because they are basically sealed off from any sort of bacteria, okay? And they did that for a reason, because they thought, as I mentioned before, that if it was any sort of bacteria getting to this body, that it meant the soul was not intact with the body itself, okay? And that's why they wanted to make sure that it was completely sealed off. Okay, so one of the biggest things we see with Egypt is the social structure. Now, this one's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Obviously, number one on the top is going to be the pharaoh. Number two would be then government officials, high-ranking, probably rich elites of the area, and also the priests. Three would be military officials and soldiers. Four would be scribes. These are people that were trained in writing in hieroglyphics. Right, not everybody in Egypt can write in hieroglyphics. It was the scribes that did a lot of the record keeping. Number five was the merchants. Obviously, merchants are a pretty big deal when they're connected to the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and they can trade along the Nile River. So they were pretty, they had a lot of money. Six was the craftsmen. So these were people that had made the pottery, made the different types of art styles. They were seen as higher than the last group, which is farmers and slaves, right? Now, probably one of the most famous things I mentioned was hieroglyphics, the writing system which they had. I always make a joke that it seems that as time progresses, we started off in hieroglyphics, we go to written code, and now we're back to using hieroglyphics again. Because we have emojis. People can literally talk using emojis. I mean, it's not the same thing as hieroglyphics, but it's similar. The fact is that each of these symbols represents either a different letter or a different phrase or different, an animal or a term, okay? And it's complicated. As in, we didn't really know about how to decipher hieroglyphics until we saw the Rosetta Stone, okay? And the Rosetta Stone had a kind of a translation that was, they translated it all into like Greek language, and then we were able to translate it from there, right? Now, these hieroglyphics were, as I said, a symbol-based written code. And after we understood what it was saying with the Rosetta Stone, we were able to translate a lot of the text that we had found made during that time period. Okay. When it comes to Egyptian science and technology, they excelled in that as well. Clearly, with the pyramids, they have to know how to be very good in science and math, right? They have to know how to build these pyramid structures pretty efficiently. When it comes to medicine, they were masters of mummification. So they clearly understood the human body and how it worked. So they excelled in surgery. They excelled in repairing the human body from breaking of bones. And probably one of the coolest things I thought was the fact that they had created a calendar system. Now, the reason why they created the calendar system was because they wanted to chart when flooding was going to occur. Right? And we kind of use a lot of the aspects of Egyptian calendar for even modern day things. Now, with that being said, the kingdoms are separated into different groups. Now, the Old Kingdom ends up declining around 2180 BC, and then the Middle Kingdom doesn't last that long either, from 2040 BC to 1640 BC. It doesn't last that long, and the reason why is because just like Mesopotamia, nomadic groups end up taking over. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, there was a defensive barrier with the desert, but that doesn't necessarily stop invasions altogether. Now, we'll talk about Egypt again in a different chapter, but for right now, they end up losing their power and to the Hyksos. All right, these are nomadic groups from Palestine, end up taking them over. And we'll talk about, like I said, we'll talk about Egypt at a later time. Okay. So with that being said, let's jump into the worksheet, the Egyptian document practice.